Okay, so it's 7 and we're gonna get started. Welcome everyone to a new Current Conversations. We're really excited to be talking tonight with Michael Gusmano, who is a research scholar at the Hastings Center here in Garrison and also a professor at Rutgers University. We're gonna be talking about COVID-19 vaccine development, about safety, effectiveness, distribution, all the many layers that make this a very difficult process. If you have questions along the way, feel free to send them using the Q&A. We'll try to get through as many as we can. I know our senior editor, Leonard Sparks, probably has a bunch of questions already. So I'm gonna hand it over to you guys so we can get started.
Okay, thanks, Teresa. And thank you, Michael, for doing this. I think you cannot understate the importance or overstate the importance of a vaccine right now. But before we get started, can you first tell us a little bit about your work with Hastings and with Rutgers?
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much for inviting me to do this. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I've been affiliated with the Hastings Center as a research scholar for nearly 11 years, and I've been at Rutgers for the past 5 in the School of Public Health. About half of my research really looks at the politics of health reform in the United States. So I look at Medicare, Medicaid, the implementation of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. But I've always spent a lot of time looking at the governance and the ethics of new and emerging technologies, including vaccines. The other half of my work is kind of cross-national in nature. So I look at health systems around the world and compare the US with other countries. For the past 21 years, I've been comparing big cities around the world.
Okay, thank you. And let's get right to the questions. The first one, is, has there ever, to your knowledge, been an effort to, develop a vaccine to rival this effort in terms of speed and scale?
No, I mean, this is absolutely remarkable in many ways. I mean, to put it into context, we now have multiple vaccine candidates that are entering phase 3 human clinical trials. These are the really large trials designed to assess safety and effectiveness right before regulatory agencies make a decision about whether they can be released to the public. Phase 1 trials, which are very small human clinical trials, usually involving fewer than 100 people, just to figure out, for example, whether the vaccine candidate can produce some antibodies and appears to be safe. Those trials can sometimes take 1 to 2 years just for phase 1. So the speed with which this is happening and the global scale is pretty breathtaking, actually.
This is one of the burning questions I have. What can we expect of a vaccine in terms of effectiveness and safety?
Sure. Well, I mean, certainly if we get to a point, assuming there's no political interference with the regulatory process, which we certainly hope, and I certainly do have some hopes that that's going to be the case. Typically, a vaccine is not going to be approved by the FDA for use unless the side effects are either non-existent or really mild. Soreness in the arm, perhaps a low-grade fever, the kind of thing that people warn you about with an annual flu shot, for example. In terms of effectiveness, it's really difficult at this stage to know for sure, and it's difficult on a couple of different levels. A minimum threshold that the FDA is likely to use is that it's going to be 50% effective. But of course, that doesn't tell you about the duration of the effectiveness, and there could be different levels of effectiveness depending on subgroups. So it may be that younger people respond more positively to the vaccine than older people. And so we'll just have to wait and see once we get more evidence from the trials.
And you mentioned the word duration, and I think that sort of leads into my next question about how often vaccine will have to be administered. I mean, I think, when I think of one, I think, well, is it going to be annual, like a flu shot? Is it going to be a one-off where you take it once and just never have to take it again, or somewhere along that spectrum?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one we don't know is the most honest answer. And one of the reasons we don't know is we don't even know yet fully about the extent to which antibodies from COVID confer protection and how long that protection lasts if they do. And that's one of the things that they're going to try to test with this. It could be that it's a one-off or maybe a one-off with a booster. Again, thinking of these different segments of the population, it could be a situation where older people need to get a booster even though younger people do not. Or it certainly could be like the annual flu shot, where you simply have to keep going back every year. And that raises the challenge of making sure that you can get to some form or close to herd immunity, because whether you're talking about doses or how frequently you need to take it, the more challenging it is, right? If it's a one-off, one dose, and you can take it once and be protected forever, fabulous. We probably won't even know the answer to that question if we get to the end of phase 3 trials and the FDA approves one or more vaccines. The reason I say that is we are going to have knowledge about the time period during which people had the vaccine in their system from the time the clinical trial started to when it's approved. If that's 6 months, we'll have 6 months of data. If that's a year, we'll have a year of data. It is possible, right, that you could have some decline in protection beyond that period. And that's why even if we get to a stage where one or more vaccines is safe and effective and becomes available, it's going to be very important to continue to do post-marketing surveillance and continued research to figure out, just how long does the vaccine last.
Now, you mentioned herd immunity, and that's obviously been in the news the last couple of days.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Sure. Basically, it is a concept that is used mostly in the context of vaccines to sort of, when you reach a point in the population where enough people have immunity or protection against a disease, that it makes it very difficult or very low probability that there can be spread. Because with any vaccine, of course, there may be people who simply can't take the vaccine. Some vaccines are incubated in eggs. People who have an egg allergy can't take it. Other people who may be immunocompromised can't take it. And so herd immunity becomes very important, because if you can lower what's called the R0 value, which a lot of people are talking about, right? The rate of infection in the community down to, close to zero, even if you yourself don't have the vaccine or are unable to take the vaccine, the probability of you contracting the virus and getting the disease are very low. The difficulty with the current conversations about herd immunity is that it is, as the WHO recently put it, absolutely unethical to think about trying for herd immunity by allowing enough people to get sick that you would achieve this. You would be talking about arguably global millions of people dying. We're now talking about hundreds of thousands of people dying, but assuming the death rate continued at approximately the same level that we've seen so far, the public health consequences of actually achieving herd immunity just by allowing people to be exposed to the virus would be horrific.
I'm gonna take one of the questions we have right now, because it sort of fits in with where we're at. It's a question from a viewer, do we even know enough about COVID-19 to make an effective vaccine? Scientists are still saying they're always still learning about the virus.
Well, it's a very good question. I think we've learned a lot. It's also important to recognize that while this is a novel coronavirus, there are many coronaviruses, right? The common cold is a coronavirus. So in fact, in terms of the structure of the disease, many people I'm sure have seen, online or on their televisions or in the newspaper, these sort of blown up graphics kind of showing the coronavirus with its crowns. And it turns out that is potentially very important for how you intercept this, right? How the antibodies block the virus. And so the good news is that this isn't the first coronavirus, and there has actually been years and years of research on how to develop vaccines, not all of them successful. But even though we're starting with a new virus and there's a lot to learn, first of all, again, the global effort has been remarkable. The amount of data sharing is remarkable. And we're not actually starting tabula rasa with regard to coronaviruses overall. So you're right to be skeptical. You're right to be concerned, because even though many people are hopeful, and again, we do have some evidence from the phase 1 and phase 2 trials that some of these vaccine candidates seem to be moving in the right direction. What does that mean? They're producing antibodies that we would like to see. They are safe in terms of minor side effects. Whether or not ultimately they provide sufficient protection to be worth any potential risk, we just don't know yet.
I'm going to take another viewer question. We sort of touched on this earlier, but I'm going to throw this out there. 3 trials have been paused due to adverse events, and we sort of touched on those earlier. Are the events similar? And if so, does this suggest that there is a common pathway that will be problematic for any COVID-19 vaccine?
Not necessarily. The only thing that they have in common so far is that 1 or 2 people got sick, and the people running the trial, the companies running the trial, don't know why. In fact, whether you're talking about the AstraZeneca trial that was paused about a month ago, or the Johnson & Johnson trial that was just paused a couple of days ago, neither one of those has confirmed whether or not it was the trial vaccine that led to the illness. So I think, while it's frustrating to think that the trials have been suspended, have been paused, in many ways, this is a really positive thing, in the sense that it reflects the fact that we are following the science, we are following appropriate protocols to protect people. We simply don't want people to be exposed to harm while trying to pursue an appropriate vaccine, and we want to proceed with caution. Even if it turns out that these individuals were harmed by the trial vaccines, it is possible that they may be able to identify some feature or some characteristic of that individual that put them at higher risk. Because again, it is possible to approve a vaccine for use for certain populations, even if it is inappropriate for everyone. So it reminds us that this is really tricky stuff. It's complicated. There's no guarantee that we will end up with a vaccine, frankly, but it isn't necessarily devastating, and it's not even unusual. Many phase 3 trials are paused if there is some evidence of harm, so that they can check the numbers, check the patients, and make sure that they can proceed in a safe manner.
And continuing with the sort of general topic of production, are there companies that have a more promising vaccine candidate than others?
It's really hard to say. I think any of the vaccine candidates, and there are multiple now, that reach a phase 3 trial, obviously that's promising, because it does mean, again, that there is some evidence, some good scientific reason to believe that they are doing something that looks like what we want, which is to produce the kinds of antibodies that provide protection, and doing so in a way with relatively small trials that have not harmed anybody. It's not clear to me that there's an obvious front runner Again, I think if you read some of the articles looking at the underlying scientific logic, I was very enthusiastic early on, even though I'm not a virologist, about the Oxford AstraZeneca. Of course, it was the first one to be paused. So what do I know? I mean, it's entirely possible that I was wrong. But I do think that, again, they're using multiple approaches, which is good. And it's possible that multiple approaches will all work. But I think it increases the probability that someone is going to find a pathway for a successful vaccine.
Now, another one of the questions we have, which is sort of related to this, is will the country that gets the vaccine first create a power struggle? And I guess there's that larger question of, how much politics and not our own, domestic, but just global politics
well, my PhD is in political science, in full disclosure. So I think politics shapes everything, and I think in many ways it's impossible to imagine that it wouldn't. The WHO and other international organizations have put out statements about appropriate allocation, thinking about need, thinking about risk, and who is affected by this. But I think the reality is that if a country has underwritten the development of a vaccine, it is likely to make sure that its citizens, or certainly its most vulnerable citizens, receive it first. Even there is no real guarantee. And my analogy would be, if you look at the CARES Act that was passed by Congress, and look, for example, at the allocation of funds to hospitals as a result of the COVID outbreak, you would imagine that the hospitals that would have received money first and would have received the most money are those hospitals that were hit hardest by COVID. In fact, with the formula they used, they based it on lost revenue, which means that many hospitals that were doing quite well before the pandemic and had a lot of cash on hand received payments from the federal government. That's not a perfect analogy, but it means that we should make sure to keep our eyes both on a global level and domestically about the politics of this, and put pressure on elected officials to make sure that the most vulnerable people who really need protection immediately, and I would include in that healthcare workers, frontline workers, have first access to the vaccine. Among other things, not only do they deserve protection, but the rest of us benefit if frontline workers are protected, whether we're talking about healthcare workers or postal workers.
Well, now that I know you have the background in political science, let's stick with politics for just a couple more questions. First, are you concerned about political interference in the U.S. From the
Sure. Listen, I think overall, the FDA has a very good reputation, and that reputation is well deserved. I think during the Trump administration, where there have been some concerns about other agencies perhaps becoming too politicized, overall during the last 4 years, I think the FDA has avoided that. I do think over the past several months, there have been some really troubling developments. When the president said things like, I think we're going to have a vaccine before a very special day, clearly alluding to the election. That was chilling, and not because I don't want a vaccine. If they had a vaccine that I thought was safe and effective tomorrow, I wouldn't be first in line because I'd want a more vulnerable person to get it. But I would think it would be wonderful. And it would be horrific if your partisan political interest led you to root against the development of a vaccine quickly. But it would be a bigger problem if we didn't let the science and the numbers drive this. And I say that not just because it is possible to harm people if you haven't done the appropriate research with a vaccine, harm them either because it has safety problems or because it doesn't confer immunity and then they change their behavior thinking they're protected. But also, it's a major public health risk because we already know we have a big anti-vaccine movement in the United States and globally. That movement is based on the presumption that the government is lying about safety and effectiveness. The last thing we should be doing is feeding into that, because the truth is the vaccines that are already on the market have gone through hundreds and hundreds of tests. They are safe, they are effective, they are one of the most important public health interventions we have. And so it's just crucial, not only in the short term, but the long term, that we make sure that the process has integrity and that we remove any possibility that some kind of short-term electoral politics schedule is driving when the FDA is going to approve something. I think the FDA has pushed back against that. And ironically, I think industry has actually pushed back against that. Like the major CEOs of all of the biopharmaceutical companies across the world signed a letter saying that they were going to adhere by appropriate protocols, because the industry leaders aren't stupid, right? They recognize that if there are questions about the integrity of the process and the safety of their product, people aren't going to use their products. They don't want that.
You know, and going beyond the testing and trials and going forward to manufacture and distribution, and in particular distribution, should we sort of keep an eye out for I don't know, political interference in how any vaccine is distributed?
Well, in terms of who's getting what first, as we've already talked about, I think that is a concern. I think with distribution, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is, because of Operation Warp Speed, because of the massive amount of money that has been put behind this effort, it not only means that the research is moving forward very quickly, but one of the things it means is that, you know, ordinarily, if you're a company developing a new vaccine, you are not going to manufacture lots of doses of that until you think you're pretty close to approval or have approval, right? So there can be a major delay between the time when your phase 3 trial ends, you get FDA approval, and then you gear up manufacturing for distribution. What's happening now is a lot of these companies are actually producing millions of doses of vaccine even before the phase 3 trials end, which means they may end up dumping some of this stuff and never using it because it doesn't get approval. They're willing to do that, which would normally be a massive financial loss, because the government is underwriting this process. And that means if we do get a winner or more than one, they will be able to gear up pretty quickly. Even having said that, though, you know, the production of vaccines is a complicated thing, right? This is going to be sort of a massive industrial project. They have to grow these things. We don't yet know whether, as we said before, it requires 1 dose or 2. We don't yet know whether the vaccine that will be approved has to be frozen or just kept in a refrigerator. The J&J vaccine candidate may only require refrigeration, where the AstraZeneca one, for example, or Moderna may have to be frozen. That changes the calculus both globally and within the US in terms of how much you can ship, where you can ship, whether or not you have the infrastructure you need. We don't know how big the vials will be. I mean, it comes down to really simple things, right? But what does that mean for packaging? What does that mean for shipping and storage? All of those things are a big concern. And of course, all of this is happening in the context of a global pandemic, which has led to disruptions in supply chains for things like glass, rubber stoppers, packaging. And obviously, we know about some of the slowdowns with mail delivery. These things are all relevant for distribution.
You know, one of our viewer questions related to this, does the U.S. have the medical infrastructure to manufacture, deliver, and administer an approved vaccine in a timely way? Is that sort of the answer to be determined, or just?
Well, I think the U.S. is in a much better position than sort of many lower income countries. I worry a great deal about, sub-Saharan Africa, about parts of Southeast Asia where the healthcare infrastructure is not really as well developed, where issues of electricity and refrigeration and the sort of the distribution infrastructure is less well developed. And so, for Africa, for India, for other parts of Southeast Asia, there's going to need to be an important global effort to protect those people. Certainly we know in the context of the US, right, that there are fewer healthcare resources in rural areas. And so there has to be a special effort to reach out. And certainly, and I'm hopeful about this, but there have been some reports where people in testing, for example, have received surprise billing. One of the other things that we have to make sure is that that we don't create financial barriers to people receiving this. And so that's going to be crucial. We know in the US, one of the biggest sources, one of the biggest barriers to people receiving timely and appropriate health care is money.
Another one of our questions is, once a vaccine is deemed ready, by public health officials, well, how do you expect it to be delivered? And I'm not sure physically, but certainly there's a question of, is it going to be a shot? Is it going to be, I don't know.
I would expect it's probably going to be a shot, but again, I don't really know, and we're going to have to wait to see. There's so many candidates out there, but I would anticipate it's a shot. In terms of where it's delivered, again, I think if you look at what are fairly sketchy guidelines from Health and Human Services right now, they're expecting this to roll out likely in 3 phases, and that sounds right to me. The first phase, they're anticipating they're really going to have to limit the distribution because they're just not going to have enough for everyone. So again, you're talking about high priority populations, doctors and nurses and other frontline workers in hospitals and clinics, people working in nursing homes, perhaps residents of nursing homes if it's appropriate. And so there will have to be a distribution plan with public-private partnerships to get those doses out to those institutions to protect the frontline workers. With the second phase, then you're going to have more of a broad public distribution. And there I anticipate it will work just like, flu shots and other kinds of vaccines, where you can probably go to your local pharmacy or local clinic or doctor's office and receive this. Again, the details of that, exactly how this is going to be distributed across the country and when, the cost issues, all of that are yet to be determined. And in fairness to the government, I think part of the challenge is that without the technical details of knowing exactly what this thing looks like and what it requires, it's they're in a wait and see game. But I do think there is work that can be done and should be being done on how do we think about and how do we define those high priority populations, because it seems implausible to believe, even with Operation Warp Speed, that you'll be able to, vaccinate several hundred million people in the first few months after this is ready.
What's your best guess for, time frame for just widespread distribution, it being available to anybody who wants it?
I would think an incredibly optimistic time scenario would be mid to late 2021 from everything I'm reading and the experts that I respect who have said this. And that would be an incredible scenario.
Without a vaccine, what we're doing now, is that pretty much going to remain the status quo?
Well, I do think in addition to all the vaccine work, there is work moving forward with therapeutics. And again, I am deeply concerned about the push toward emergency use authorization by the FDA. The reason that's a problem is if you have something, a therapeutic, whether it's convalescent plasma or something else, that may be helpful, the more you put that out without doing the research first, the more it kind of pollutes the data so that you never actually learn whether the positive results you're getting are due to the intervention. That's why we have these randomized controlled clinical trials with placebos, with control groups. Scientifically, it helps you better understand what's happening. So one thing clearly is, even without a vaccine, we are making progress in terms of therapeutics, in terms of techniques. One of the earlier questions about, don't we know very little about the vaccine, the virus? And certainly that's true. But in terms of treating COVID-19, even, we have learned a lot more, right? Simple things like, the usual standards for when you put somebody on a ventilator have changed. In this, they're less likely to put you on a ventilator. They're more likely to put you in a prone position. Some simple steroids can offer some benefit, as apparently they did to the president. And so we have learned some things that have helped reduce the rate of death once you become severely ill. It's still an incredibly risky proposition, and we're learning more all the time about long-term health consequences. But I think whether we get a vaccine soon or later, we are going to have to continue to get on message and get people to change their behavior, to behave, frankly, the way we've been behaving in New York, New Jersey, and the Northeast, which is mask wearing, social distancing, hand washing. It sounds almost painfully simple, right? That these low-tech kinds of things could be effective. But if you look at the way you can reduce the risk of transmission, the risk of illness, the risk of death by wearing a mask, by washing your hands frequently, not touching your face, and trying to not remain indoors in a poorly ventilated area with other people for long periods of time without a mask. If we had a pill that you could swallow that would reduce your risk of death by that percentage, we'd be willing to pay massive amounts of money for it.
Here's another question. It's, is there a comparable virus that was successfully conquered through a vaccine? And if so, how long did that process take?
I can't really think of one, to be perfectly frank. I mean, I guess polio would not be a bad analogy if you want to think about the scale and the scope and the devastation. And obviously that took years to develop a polio vaccine, right? I mean, I'm older than I'd like to be, but I'm not that old. And I'm old enough that when I was a small child, I knew people who had polio. My guess is if you ask anyone under the age of 40 whether they have met anyone who had polio, they'll just look at you like you're crazy, because you simply don't see it in the United States anymore. But for decades, right, that was a very real threat. And really, that's the only thing I can imagine, right? The so-called Spanish flu, which didn't originate in Spain, 1918, which most people forgot about, and we've all been learning about over the last 6 months, that they never developed a vaccine for that, right? So no, I can't really think of anything.
And actually, that was one of our questions, fewer questions in the 1950s with the worldwide fear about polio. It seems they were also moving as quickly as possible to get a vaccine to the public. What was the timetable for the polio vaccine?
No, it was years. I mean, again, it's simply not even close to what we're doing right now. Again, we don't yet know whether we're going to be successful, but if we are successful on anything close to the time frame that people are hoping for, again, but no later than the end of 2021, but frankly, even it's 2022, with a vaccine that would so far outpace anything that I have seen, it would just be breathtaking.
Now, will there, let's just best case scenario, post-vaccine, will there be a time where, post-vaccine, we can go back to filling sports stadiums and the dance floors and nightclubs and kids can just sort of gather in school and play freely without masks.
I have no doubt that at some point, whether I'm around for it, we'll see, but I'm sure at some point, right, we are going to get past this. Whether things will ever be completely the same, I'm not so sure, and I don't know that we want things to be completely the same. Frankly, if people are more cautious about being indoors, if they're more cautious about hand washing and touching their face and the other very simple things that you can do, that would be good. If we institute more regular mask wearing when people are, and staying home when people are feeling ill, right? There was an article very early on, it was actually criticizing Chris Cuomo of CNN, who you may recall when he had COVID was coming on and in the middle of his illness and talking about his experience. And he was trying to convey to people what it was like to have this disease, but as someone pointed out, he's sending all the wrong message, that you should be tough and you should continue to work even when you're sick. And as the person who wrote this article pointed out, that's one of the things that happens even in healthcare settings before this, is people would show up even though they were sick because they felt they needed to be there. That needs to change, right? We need to get rid of that kind of nonsense macho attitude. And if you're sick, stay home. Take care of yourself and take care of others. So I also think we should really be rethinking the way we design cities and epidemiological surveillance. One of the dreadful things that's happened, and this isn't accelerated during the Trump administration, but it preceded the Trump administration over multiple presidential administrations, we've had a decline in real dollar funding for public health. Right? It is the kind of thing you don't want to have to spend money on because it usually isn't an immediate issue. So the basic infrastructure of epidemiological surveillance, the capacity to do contact tracing, these are things that can be employed rapidly with appropriate disaster preparedness so that if you have an outbreak, if you have a flare-up, you can tamp it down before it becomes a disaster and it overwhelms the healthcare system. So I think if we ever get serious about these public health measures and we can reduce the rate of community infection, even without a vaccine, yes, I will imagine that in most of our lifetimes, we're going to be back in sports stadiums, we're going to be back in crowded restaurants. Will there be some risk? Yes, but the risk hopefully will be much lower and we will be in a better position to respond if things look like they're getting out of hand, rather than taking days, weeks, in some cases months, while we said, oh, don't worry, it's a hoax, it's not real, and ignored the problem.
Well, and of course that morphed into, oh, it's real, but it'll go away soon. And I think from what you're saying, this is not a virus that's just going to disappear as quickly as it appeared. That it will be.
I think we're likely to be living with this coronavirus for a very long time. I do think, however, we have the capability, both through therapeutics, potentially through vaccines, and through public health interventions, to get the viral spread under control to the point where it isn't shutting down the economy, it isn't dominating people's lives, interfering with their educations and all the rest.
Okay. And one last question, which may be the most important one. Would you be willing to return every 3 months to keep us up to date on the virus?
Absolutely. I'd always be happy to come back and chat. It'd be my pleasure.
Because obviously we're in the midst of a process that's obviously going to be long, and I think we're in some ways still at a certain beginning in terms of that overall process. So
no, I think that's right, and also I have to admit I'm one of the privileged people. I certainly go out in the world, I grocery shop, I do those kinds of things, but I work at a bioethics center, and I work at a school of public health at Rutgers that is being incredibly responsible. So I am teaching online. My faculty meetings are online. My research is online. And so I'm able to protect myself in ways that unfortunately many workers can't, which means that I'm hopeful, if not confident, I'm hopeful that I'll be well enough every 3 months to check back with you. And that's an important thing for us to remember, for those of us who can do things like this and have Zoom conversations. Not everybody has that chance.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michael. It's just been a very good conversation, and I really look forward to having it again down the road as we move along this process. So,
great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. Take care.
Sure.
Thank you so much. This was super informative, and we'll be posting it online on YouTube tomorrow. So if anybody missed it or wants to share it with anybody, we'll have that link up tomorrow.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay, good night.
Good night.